Gene codes. Session 14. The honeymoon effect. I also like to identify it as the phase of infatuation, which I'll talk about that in a moment. Many years ago, when I was studying EFT, Emotional Freedom Technique, which I think I may add that to the gene codes as well. It's something that I'd like to talk about. It's something that I think is fitting as a subject for gene codes. But I was studying Emotional Freedom Technique, and the founder and developer of it, Gary Craig, he used to have a lot of seminars. I don't even remember how I got those. I had a bunch of DVDs that I had copied, and I probably downloaded them using some peer-to-peer torrent. It was so many years ago. I have them tucked away somewhere on an external hard drive. But anyway, in one of the sessions, there was a couple that used EFT to deal with relationships. And they began to talk about the phases of a relationship. And they identified 5 phases that people go through in a relationship. And the first phase was the phase of infatuation. And then there was the phase of conflict. And then there was the phase of cooperation. And then there was the phase of synergy. And then finally, there's the phase of conclusion. Now, it was a very interesting talk, and I was really, really taken in by it, because at that time I was living the life of a single man, not wanting to deal with relationships. I was really focused on my own self-healing, and I was really focused on trying to understand, should I or should I not be in a relationship? How can I find a way to go through the necessary process of healing so that I can be perhaps a better partner, or so that I can determine whether or not it would be fitting for me to be in relationships, or is it just better for me to be in a relationship with myself, in a relationship with life? Because I know that as a dynamic assertive, my first relationship is with life. Above any other relationship, I am engaged with life. But one of the things that really captured me was the phase of infatuation. They really got me with that one. I was taken aback by the phase of conclusion, because it really never dawned on me to think of conclusion as not necessarily a separating, but coming to an end of a particular chapter, so that you can then reinvent the relationship, reinvigorate the relationship, refresh the relationship. But that's not what the important part is. The important part is the phase of infatuation. And I became really, really interested in this phase of infatuation, because it was the phase, and is the phase, in which we feel the greatest pleasure of the euphoria of something new. And although they were talking about relationships, when I identified the feeling of infatuation, the experiences that I have often had with infatuation, I then began to realize that this phase of infatuation, in fact, is not something that is just within relationships, but it's across the board. When you go into a new experience, there is this phase of infatuation. And in this phase of infatuation, you can be in the workplace, you can have a new job, you can have a new car, you can have a new video game, you can have a new friend, you can have anything that is new that gives you a sense of euphoria, that kind of feeling of, wow, this is great. You kind of idealize it. And I started to study this, because when I looked at those 5 phases, the phase of conflict, which comes after the phase of infatuation, is the thing that troubled me the most. Because in the phase of infatuation, it seems like the whole world is just going to be perfect. The relationship is going to be perfect. Things just seem so great. And then after this phase of infatuation, you come into the phase of conflict. And that used to always trouble me because I used to always think, why? Why does this phase of infatuation, why does this euphoric feeling have to end? Because it always ended, no matter what. And that's when I started to pay more attention to being more mindful of not tricking myself, not fooling myself into believing that I had, found heaven when I find myself in this phase of infatuation. Then came along Dr. Bruce Lipton, an amazing cellular biologist with an amazing sense of spirituality, a man who went through his own revolution within himself, went through his own rebirth. He came along and talked about the honeymoon effect. And that's when everything kind of clicked into place. And I started to understand this phase of infatuation and what actually happens to you on a biological level, on an internal level, as well as an energetic level. And what Dr. Lipton described is what I had always thought of as the phase of infatuation, where you somehow overcome all of your conditioning and you suddenly become this person, this soul, this being that finally sees everything on an optimistic level, a euphoric level, a positive level. But he also described exactly what the couple had described in saying that this phase eventually comes to an end. And it comes to an end because it is a temporary overriding. The way that Dr. Lipton explained it is that this phase of infatuation, this honeymoon effect, as he calls it, brings you to a point where you are so optimistic, you are so overjoyed that no matter how strong your negative conditioning has been in life, this becomes a moment of time in which you can override that, you can overpower that. You know, people go through years and years of therapy and psychology, psychiatry. They go and see their therapist, and yet this phase of infatuation has the power to do what a therapist may not even be able to do it in years, in a number of years. So the important thing that I want to stress, the important thing that I want to bring to this gene codes is that it is something that innately happens. It is something that it can either be an opportunity or an absolute disastrous disappointment. The phase of infatuation, this honeymoon effect, is something that I have learned to be extremely careful with. And trust me, it really is across the board, whether a new activity, a new initiative. There's always at the beginning this sense of everything is idealistically, optimistically wonderful and everything is going to go great. But we have to be very mindful that after the phase of infatuation, you will come to the phase of conflict. And it is precisely in the phase of infatuation that you overlook all of the negativities. You overlook at all of the defects. And it is precisely because of that when the phase of infatuation and when your biology starts to kick back in with all of your negative conditioning, that the phase of conflict comes in. And I've seen this over and over in many different situations. You can even go to a new platform. You can even come to Steam, you can even come to DTube and have this euphoric sense of wow. But mind you, you will then eventually come into the phase of conflict. And I won't go into the other phases at this moment. Maybe when I cycle back around, I'll go in through the other phases so that we can understand how we can go from the phase of infatuation to the phase of conclusion, and then at that point determine how we can get back into the phase of infatuation and cycle back through if it is worth it to continue that particular relationship. Well, that's just an introductory idea of this honeymoon effect, and hopefully we'll come back to it. And Yes, short and sweet today, but I needed to get one of these gene codes in. I think I'm going to add game theory, and I had one other, yes, emotional freedom technique. I'm going to add those to the list of the gene codes. So listen, everyone, thank you for the support. Thank you for listening, and we will catch up soon for another session.